So I'm Kimberly Doran. I'm the licensing coordinator for the Minnesota Board of Social Work. And my goal with you today is to talk about what the Board of Social Work is, what the license requirements are in Minnesota, touch on the standards of practice and complaint process around that, and then talk about the application process, which is typically the most interesting for students because that's what's next in your social work journey. And then, assuming that we have time at the end, cover supervised practice, continuing education, and license renewal. Once you are a licensed social worker, those are the commitments that you're making to be licensed in Minnesota. Before I jump into stuff, I just have a couple of screenshots of the homepage for the Board of Social Work website. And I just want to send you to two different places where you can get information after this presentation that's specific to you guys now. On the far left, there's a tab for applicants, and in that drop-down, there's a drop-down that says social work students specifically. Again, so that's geared exactly to you right now. Toward the right-hand side of the website, there's a resources tab, and all kinds of things that you're going to need throughout your career are on that resources tab. But in particular, there's one for licensing videos. And so a bunch of what I cover today has been put into some videos that you could go back and watch. So if you're like, wait, what'd you say about compliance? What was that about supervision? All that kind of stuff. It's on some of those videos. So that's just another resource for you moving forward. So I'm just going to quickly talk about what the board does and who the board is. The board is a member of the executive branch of state government. And the biggest piece about that is really two things. One, the board has to be accountable to the public and to several stakeholders that have a vested interest in social work practice in Minnesota. And the work that the board does has to be transparent. So there's no behind the scenes kinds of work that's happening. The board meetings are open to the public. You can attend them, have an idea about who's on the board, what they're working on. Transparency is one of the requirements. The board itself is made up of 15 members. 10 of them are licensed social workers in Minnesota, representing the breadth of social work practice in Minnesota and all of the different license types in Minnesota. And then there are 12 of us staff that work on behalf of the board in the office, or in the offices of our home as it is right now. The mission of the board is public protection. This is an important distinction from an association or an advocacy group for social work that you may be a member of or be familiar with moving forward. And their role is really promoting the profession, advocating for the profession, or advocating for social workers. The mission of the board is public protection specifically. And public protection is a derivative of the state statute. Everything that the board can do, is required to do, is statutorily defined in the Minnesota Social Work Practice Act, which is the Minnesota State Law 148E. And the overarching goal by protecting the public is to protect the public is through having qualified, professional, ethical, and accountable social workers that are engaged in practice in Minnesota. The Social Work Practice Act, I'm going to reference it off and on throughout the course of the conversation today, and I would highly recommend that you take some time to look at this. This is the legislation that governs everything that we can do as social workers in Minnesota. You can see on the side the list of areas that are covered in that state law. All of those areas are things around which and over which the board has licensing authority, and a definition of what we can do, how we can engage in our practice, what we cannot do. There's two other statutes in Minnesota that are not unique to social workers, but are relevant to us in our practice. The first is Chapter 214, and this applies to all of the health licensing boards in Minnesota. It talks about how data is classified, the complaint process, which I'll cover in a little bit, and then the criminal background check, which is fingerprint-based. One of the things about the criminal background check is, as government agencies, we can't share the background check information with each other. So if you've had criminal background check done through, say, the Department of Education, fingerprint-based for them as well, we can't share that information. You have to do it specifically for each agency. The other statute that is relevant to us is Chapter 13. And there's a couple things about this. The first, I already talked about the transparency of the board, and that falls under the open meeting law. And you absolutely can attend any of the board meetings or the committee meetings. Those schedules are posted on the board website. At the moment, those meetings are all still virtual, so it's super easy to attend them. And it might be of interest to you to find out who they are and what they're working on. The other is the government data practices. And this is important to be aware of because it defines the information that you provide to the board. What of that information is public, what's private, and what's confidential. The example I like to talk about is your address. It's a requirement to submit a public address to the board, which means that folks have access to that. As a student, that's typically not an issue for you when you build your profile to begin with. But as you move through your social work practice, that may become an issue for you depending on who your client base is and the kind of social work that you're engaging in. A number of us use our professional address as our public address. So it's just important to be aware that there is a distinction between public, private, and confidential data as you move forward. All of this really is just talking about the fact that social work in Minnesota is a regulated profession. That's not unique to Minnesota. It's true all across North America, the United States, and Canada. One of the things that's important to be aware of is all the information I'm going to talk about today is unique to Minnesota. Each state and jurisdiction has its own statutory requirements for licensure and supervision and continuing education, all of that kind of stuff. We don't have a national license. We have national exams. And the exam scores are good in most of the states in the United States and a bunch of the Canadian provinces, but we do not have a national license. And you are in a border city. If you're going to stay in Duluth, you may be practicing in Superior as well as Duluth or instead of Duluth. And so then it's your responsibility to be aware of what the licensure requirements are in Wisconsin if you're going to be practicing there. So just as a frame of reference about information today. So any questions about what the board is, who it's made up of, any of that kind of stuff? Okay. So when is a license required? So this goes back to that Minnesota Social Work Practice Act, that state law, that defines what the board has licensing authority over. And specifically, the board has authority over folks who have a degree from an accredited social work program, a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, and the work that they are doing meets the definition of social work practice in that state statute. So if you have a degree and the work meets the definition, then the board has licensing authority, which means a license to practice is required in Minnesota. The other thing over which the board has licensing authority is the title social worker. You can only use that title if you are licensed to practice in Minnesota. One of the important things to be aware of with this licensing authority is that the board does not have jurisdiction over organizations or agencies. And this can sometimes create an issue for folks when they go to get a job. You know, you may apply, you've interviewed, and they're like, you are who we want. Your education, your training, you are exactly the candidate that we want. No need for a license here. We're not the least bit interested in that. Don't worry about it. That may be fine for that agency, but back to, you're all going to have a degree in social work from an accredited institution. If the work they're hiring you to do meets that definition of social work practice, you are required to have a license, regardless of what that agency has to say about it. So I'm using that language, social work practice. This is the beginning of the definition in that state statute. And as you can see, just that first sentence is incredibly broad. It covers a pretty vast amount of the type of work that you may choose to engage in. Again, worth your time to go look at that state law and take a look at the definition of social work practice. There's a definitions page when you go to the state statute. Subdivision 11 is the full definition of social work practice. And then for those of you who may be considering a master's degree and thinking about clinical practice, there's a specific definition of clinical practice, and you can read how that's distinct from traditional generalist or macro social work practice. When we're talking about social work practice, it's just important to bear in mind that we're not just talking about the direct practice. That's what a lot of us think about, you know, that kind of boots on the ground, working individually with a client or a client system, some sort of work in that capacity. But it also encompasses our macro level colleagues that are doing big program development, policy development, things like that. That also is in that definition of social work practice. In terms of the kinds of things that we see folks doing in Minnesota, this is a list of some of the more common things that are coming in on supervision plans. This list is not exhaustive. It's definitely not everything that all the social workers are doing in Minnesota, but it gives you an idea of kind of the breadth of practice that we're seeing pretty frequently on the supervision plans that are coming in. In terms of where do you find social workers, the short answer is we are everywhere, quite literally. There are over 16,000 licensed social workers in the state of Minnesota. We represent approximately 70% of the mental health and social service delivery that's happening in the state. So we're in a lot of places doing a lot of really important work. Again, this list is not exhaustive, but it gives you a general idea of some of the more common areas that social work is being practiced in Minnesota. Okay, so back to the concept about the board's licensing authority. And I really want to hammer this so that there's not an issue for folks about engaging in unlicensed practice. So again, the board has authority over anybody who has a degree in social work and the work that they're doing meets the definition of social work practice. If that's the case, those folks must have a license to practice. Your employer may feel differently about that. You may not have direct service contact, maybe doing the big picture macro social work, and your job may not be, in fact, frequently is not social worker. Case manager, mental health practitioner, licensing coordinator. There's all different titles that social workers have, but if the work meets the definition of social work practice, it is a requirement to have a license. So I say all of that, and now here's a couple of exemptions that we have in Minnesota. The first of which is you guys as students. Any kind of practicum or internship that you're involved in does not fall under the purview of the Board of Social Work. That's under the purview of your school because that's considered academic training. So none of that falls under the Board of Social Work. Currently, social workers who are employed by a county agency in Minnesota are exempt from licensure. The board would recommend that folks that work for the county be licensed. Two big things. One, it continues the common standard for social work practice in Minnesota. And should you choose to leave county employment, you will need a license to work in another social work arena. The other area where a license is not required is anybody working for a federally recognized tribe. Many of the folks that work for the tribal agencies and organizations have a license through the Minnesota Board of Social Work, but it is not required. And there are tribes that also that have their own licensure pathway in Minnesota. And the final area would be if you have another license, like a marriage and family therapy license or a licensed psychologist, those folks, they can have a degree in social work and be practicing under that license so long as they're representing themselves under that license and not as a social worker. And then they're exempt from needing a social work license. So any questions about when a license is required or an exemption to licensure? Yeah.
We have a question here.
I just have a question about, like, currently I work at a group home and like my title is direct support professional, and like chances are after I graduate, my plan is to go back and get my master's. Do I still want to get a license even though like that's not my title as social worker while I'm there?
Yep, that's a great question. And the answer is probably. So take a look at your job description and then take a look at that Minnesota state statute and the definition of social work practice. And if the tasks that you have in the job description meet that definition, then absolutely you're going to need a license. That's a good question. Any other questions about that? Okay. So then I want to touch on the standards of practice. The standards of practice are in that state statute that I keep referring to. And this is really what defines our practice. What are the boundaries of our practice as social workers in Minnesota? I'm sure all of you are familiar with the NASW Code of Ethics, which really is our best practice engaging in social work as folks across the country, right? The standards of practice read a lot like the Code of Ethics. As you can see from that list, it covers many of the same sorts of things, from boundaries to professional responsibilities, ethical conduct, confidentiality, things like that. The important distinction is that these are the legal parameters for what we can and cannot do in social work practice in Minnesota. And because this is what the board has jurisdiction over, these are the areas around which a complaint can be filed against a social worker, because these are the things that the board has jurisdiction and authority to enforce. So what happens if a complaint is filed? There's a form that gets filled out, gets sent into the Board of Social Work office. We have a compliance unit specifically, so that complaint goes to those folks. The rest of us don't necessarily have access to it. We don't need to know that information. And the compliance folks are looking for a couple of things right away. The first is, does the Board of Social Work have jurisdiction over the person the complaint has been made about? Second question is, does the board have jurisdiction over the behavior that the complaint is about? And if the answer to those two things is yes, then the complaint folks open an investigation and compile all of the information about the complaint and then send it on to one of the compliance panels. The compliance panels are made up of board members. They have a whole due process system that they have to go through for reviewing complaints and a system about resolution for complaints. The board staff doesn't have a voice in those decisions. It's made up exclusively of those board members. And a complaint can have both public and non-public resolution. So back to that, what information is public and what is not. So let's say a complaint gets before the board and the panel, and the board members look at it and they say, there's really not an issue of public protection here. So we're going to dismiss this complaint entirely. If that happens, if a complaint is dismissed, that is confidential information. That's not public information. It's not posted on the website. If discipline occurs, that is public information. And that could include something like any kind of corrective or disciplinary action, like a civil penalty or a fine. It could be a requirement that the social worker engage in more education or more supervision. It could be a formal reprimand for the social worker. And at the extreme would be the suspension or the revocation of the social worker's license. Those things are public information. So in terms of where do we get complaints from, the short answer is anybody who touches the social worker. As you can see, this is all the different folks that would come in contact with a social worker. Certainly any other professionals working with the social worker, clients, their families or systems around them, folks that you're working for or licensing supervisors. We do have social workers that know that they have violated a standard of practice and they report themselves. And then on the information, any information that you would provide to us as staff members, if it's clear that a standard of practice has been violated, we would also open a complaint. So in terms of the most common complaints that we see, that unlicensed practice that I talked about, folks start a job, they don't have their license yet. That's a violation of a standard of practice. So that's where the timeline, and we'll talk about your application timeline in a bit, but it's really important to be aware of what your job description is and whether or not it matches that definition in the state statute. Other common complaints, boundary violations, confidentiality, documentation and billing, reporting requirements in Minnesota, terminating client services, and then issues around impairment. And impairment is looking at chemical health, mental health, or possibly physical health. And the impairment would have to be such that it's creating an issue of public protection and the social worker's inability to work safely with their clients. There's an agency, and this is kind of for the back of your mind, but an HPSP, Health Professional Services Program, is an organization that is available to all of us that have a health license in Minnesota. And it can be used in a couple of different ways. If a complaint is filed against a social worker and it's an issue of impairment, and it gets before that panel, the panel can make a determination. Instead of engaging in discipline, they're going to refer the social worker to HPSP for services. That would be one of the instances where the resolution is private information. It's not public information. You could refer yourself. You could recommend it to a colleague. And the goal behind this HPSP program is to, it kind of looks like case management and service delivery. So really taking a look at the impairment and what does the social worker need to get back to a place of health so they can safely engage with their clients. So again, for the back of your mind, but it's a service that's available to all of us that are licensed, which is a nice opportunity. So any questions about the standards of practice, where to find them, what's involved with them, or with the complaint process? My 2 cents is, if you look at nothing else in that state statute, be familiar with the standards of practice. They govern what we can do. It's important to know what the boundaries of our practice are. Okay, how do you apply for a license? This is typically the most interesting part of the presentation for folks because this is what's next on the agenda for you. We have 4 different license types in Minnesota. The first, which is going to be available to you guys coming up shortly, is the LSW, Licensed Social Worker. This is for people who have a bachelor's degree in social work from an accredited institution and have taken and passed the bachelor's exam through ASWB. For those of you that are going to go back to school and get your MSW, the first license that would be available to you once you've completed your MSW program is the LGSW, Licensed Graduate Social Worker. So again, MSW and have taken and passed the ASWB master's exam. And once you have the LGSW, then you're really picking a pathway. Are you going to be engaging in clinical or non-clinical social work practice? For our colleagues that are engaged in non-clinical practice, there's the option of the LISW, which is the Licensed Independent Social Worker. Accredited MSW program, completed the required non-clinical supervised practice, and have taken and passed the ASWB Advanced Generalist exam. For our clinical colleagues, there's the LICSW, Licensed Independent Clinical Social Worker. Again, accredited MSW, have met the minimum standard of practice or supervised practice, have documented 360 clinical clock hours, which is academic training through the MSW program or additional training, and have taken and passed the ASWB clinical exam. So those are the 4 different license types. And again, the LSW is the one that's most relevant to you at the moment. So how do you go about making this happen? The first thing is submitting an application online. You can start this application up to 6 months before your graduation. So if you're graduating June 1st, back it up 6 months. That's the earliest time that you can start it. You don't have to start it then. We recommend that you start it earlier than not if your plan is to engage in social work when you graduate, because this is the timeline issue for you. So if you wait until you graduate, it's going to take a couple of months before you could possibly be licensed. So if you're planning on working after graduation, shortly after graduation, starting the process earlier is better. The first thing that you do is you go to the Board of Social Work website, you build your profile and submit an application. It's pretty easy to do. It costs $60 for the application and then $33.25 for the criminal background check. You send all of that money in together. The Board of Social Work does not do the criminal background check ourselves. There's an office, a criminal background check office that does that, and will forward your fee onto them for that. An important plug to please ensure that you have an accurate email address on your application. It's important for 2 reasons. The first of which is we are really finding as staff that we are communicating more and more frequently via email with applicants and licensees. So a plug not only for your application, but then moving throughout your career to ensure that the email address you have in your profile is accurate. And the second thing that's critical is the criminal background check office is only going to reach out to you via email. So obviously, if you don't have an email address, that's going to create a barrier for you moving forward with your application. So that's step 1. Step 2 is the criminal background check. As I mentioned before, we can't share that amongst agencies, state agencies. So if you've had it done somewhere else, you have to do it again. Once you've submitted that application, the criminal background check office is sending you an email, and they've got all the instructions about the type of fingerprints that you need, suggestions about who can provide those fingerprints to you. So they'll have all that information. The biggest thing that we would recommend as board staff is that when you have the information from the CBC office, that you make some plans to get the fingerprints taken care of sooner rather than later. What we have found, especially during COVID, is that this is the step that slows people down. There are fewer people who are doing fingerprints than used to be, and the folks that are still doing them can do fewer in a day because of COVID restrictions. So that's an important step to be somewhat timely about. You don't have to do it the minute you get it, of course, but just to be aware of that timeline, that may take you more time than you anticipate. Step 3 is taking the national exam. And I'm going to talk specifically about the exam in a minute. But what's going to happen is you're going to get a letter from the application coordinator at the Board of Social Work that says your application is in and good. Criminal background check is underway. Here's how you contact ASWB. So you reach out to them directly. Excuse me. I clearly don't talk enough during the day. So you reach out to ASWB directly to set up your exam. It costs $230 to take the test. If you have any needs around accommodations for English not being your first language or ADA provisions, they do have them. There is an application to fill out with them for that. You can certainly contact them directly to find out what those accommodations may be. If that's something that's necessary for you or helpful for you for test taking, ASWB recommends that you submit the application to them for accommodations as soon as possible to ensure that they are noted and available to you when you go to take your test. Once that is done, you get information from ASWB about contacting Pearson VUE. Pearson VUE is the testing center, and they have sites all across North America, the United States and Canada. When you apply for your license through the Minnesota Board of Social Work, regardless of which Pearson VUE site you take your test at, the score is going to come back to the Minnesota Board of Social Work. So you have the opportunity to take the exam wherever is convenient for you. It doesn't have to be at a Pearson VUE in Minnesota. When you're sitting there taking your test, at the end, your score is going to pop up. You're going to know in that moment whether or not you passed your exam. Passing it there is not the same as being licensed. There are several other steps to get to that space. So let's assume you've got all this taken care of. You've submitted your application, your criminal background check is done and in, you've taken and passed the exam. Step 4 is your official transcript. You do need to wait until you've completed everything for your degree before you request the transcript being sent to the board. If it doesn't have the date your degree was conferred on it, it's not going to be considered a transcript that's appropriate for your application. So please wait until that's an option. So when you know that, whatever the timing is for your program, you contact the registrar's office and have them send it directly to the board. They do it all the time. It's pretty easy, but the biggest piece is just to wait until that date degree conferred is actually on the transcript. Your final step is going to be paying the licensing fee. So when all those things are done, you're going to get another letter in the mail from the application coordinator that says, welcome to the profession. You're good to go. Everything is in. The next step is just to pay for your license. The first time you pay for the LSW license, it's $93.50. That's 25% less than it's going to be moving forward when you renew your license. And that may be a prorated fee. In Minnesota, we renew our license every 2 years in the month of our birthday. So depending on when your birthday is and when you get your license initially, the cost will be different than $93.50. So for instance, if you get your license in July, but your birthday is in March, your first license renewal is going to be shorter than 24 months. So your prorated fee will be less than $93.50. If you get your license in July and your birthday's in September, your first license renewal will be longer than 24 months. So your prorated fee will be more than that. You don't have to do that math. That will all come in the information for you, but just to be aware that the $93.50 will probably look different when you get the original letter. Now, specific for you guys as students, and kind of back to the question the woman asked about having a job that's in the field and maintaining that after graduation, we have something called a temporary license. One of the things that we know to be true is that it can take a fair amount of time for the registrar's office to process transcript requests and get them sent out, especially if you're graduating at a traditional time of year. There are times that it can take a month or 2 months for that transcript to get to the board's office. So you have an option of applying for a temporary license. You can do this as you're ending school, right when you're done. And this is for folks who've done everything else. The application is in and done. Criminal background is in and done. You've taken and passed that national exam. You've completed everything you need to for your BSW program. The application fee is $50, and you can be issued the temporary license. And then when you have the temporary LSW license, you can engage in social work practice. And then once your transcript, your official transcript has been received at the board, you can be granted your permanent LSW license. So this is really for those of you that think you're going to be working in the field right after graduation, and you want to avoid that unlicensed practice requirement, violating that standard of practice. A temporary license is a really good thing for you. The other license type that we have available is an alternative pathway to licensure, and this is designed specifically for folks who are both foreign born and for whom English is not their first language. So if that works for you and you have done all of the other things, so again, application, criminal background check, completed school, successfully completed school, and you have taken the ASWB exam but have not passed it, you can apply for a provisional license. If this is something that would be appropriate for you, it's not an online application. You can reach out specifically to me or to the application coordinator, and we have paper applications for you. So again, it's just an alternative pathway for licensure for folks who meet those requirements. So any questions about how to apply for the license or what's required?
Go right ahead.
So say if you fail the exam, is there like a wait time you have to do before you can take it again?
There is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that coming up, but the ASWB has a 90-day waiting period between the first time you take the exam and when you can take it again. They have created a waiver opportunity recently about that. So if you have a job that's going to require you to be licensed, and so you need to pass the exam to be able to start work, you can submit a request with them to shorten that window of time. So typically it's 90 days, but they do have that. It's a new deal that they've created recently, which is really quite lovely for folks that need the license for work. Okay. So now I'm going to give you some more information for the back of your mind. And this is specifically for those of you that are going to move forward and get a master's degree and then pursue clinical social work practice. One of the requirements when you apply for the LICSW license is to submit a 360 clinical clock hour document, which is detailing that you have completed 360 hours of academic training in these 6 different clinical areas. No need to keep track of this at the moment. The reason that we bring it up with BSW students is if you go into a master's program, you're going in as advanced standing, which means you're going to take fewer courses than your colleagues that do not have a bachelor's degree in social work. So when you enter a master's program, it's important for you to have a conversation with your advisor about the electives that you take. If you believe that clinical practice is your pathway, just to ensure that you get as many of the 360 hours completed in your MSW program as you can. If you don't get them all done in your MSW program, it's not a big deal. There are 2 other ways, through additional coursework or through continuing ed, to get those hours done. But most of the MSW programs in Minnesota do a really lovely job with the BSW folks of ensuring that you can take the right electives to complete all those hours in your program. So just for the back of your mind, if that's a pathway that you're going to go on. Any quick questions about that? Okay. Nothing that you need to know today necessarily. Okay, so let's talk about ASWB and the exam. Big information and usually people's least favorite information. ASWB is the Association of Social Work Boards. Their primary role is this exam or these exams. They write them, study them, administer them, own them, everything. So the best source of information about these exams is ASWB, and their website has a ton of information on it. So when you have questions about the exam, my first piece of advice is start with their website. When you sit down at the computer at the testing center, all the exams are given on the computer. It's 170 questions that are going to be presented to you. 150 of them count towards your score. The other 20 are what ASWB considers pre-test questions, and they're using them for things like looking for reliability and bias and all the test metrics that they use to ensure that the exams are good and solid. But so when you have the test in front of you, just to be aware of the fact that 20 of those questions will not count towards your score. For everybody, unless an accommodation has been arranged, there's a 4-hour test limit from the time that you started. And like I talked about before, all of the tests are administered through the Pearson VUE testing centers. And again, they're all through North America, the United States and Canada, several different locations. Pearson VUE has worked really hard all the way through COVID to be as flexible as possible and as open as much as possible to get folks in to test in a pretty good timeline. And we're back to people being able to get a testing time sooner rather than later, which is really a relief across the board. Most of the Pearson VUE centers are open Monday through Saturday. And I don't know how many still have extended hours, but there were some that were open 20 or more hours a day for a while. So they've really tried to work pretty hard about getting folks in. Then they have some exam security stuff. I'll talk about that in a minute. In terms of scoring, like I mentioned before, you're going to sit down at the computer, you take your test, and at the end pops up whether or not you have passed the exam. You're going to know in that moment. It's going to take about 2 weeks for that score to get sent to the Board of Social Work. Sometimes it's as soon as 10 days, but typically it's about 2 weeks. If you do not pass the test the first time, one of the things about the ASWB system is that it's automatically going to populate a performance report for you. And it's going to let you know what went well, what did not go well, and give you some idea about what to study for the next time that you take it. And like I mentioned before, there is a 90-day waiting period to retake the exam. You do have the opportunity to apply to have that shortened if you have employment waiting on your ability to have that license. If you have to take the exam more than once, you do have to pay that $230 exam fee again to ASWB, and you would work through ASWB to set up the second exam. Now, in terms of test day tips, there's a handful of things to think about. All of the real information that you're going to need about how the test works, what's in the test, what's expected of you, is in the ASWB Candidate Handbook. That's online on their website. It's a really good place to start once you have submitted your application to have some idea about what you're getting yourself into with the exam. Some of the advice things from the Board of Social Work, the first would be really knowing where the test center is and planning accordingly with your time. And it's really not tongue-in-cheek about this. If you arrive late, you may be forfeiting your opportunity to take the exam that day, which means you're submitting a new application with ASWB, and that's a pretty expensive mistake to make, to have to pay for that a second time. So really know where you're going, because most of us don't spend a lot of time at a Pearson VUE center, and get there early enough to not have any issues with being able to take your test. The other thing, when you get the paperwork from ASWB, it's going to detail for you what they consider to be valid forms of ID, and you're going to have 2 of them. The important thing from our vantage point is just to ensure that the name that you have on the application that you submitted with the Board of Social Work matches whatever those forms of ID are. So if you have a name change, for instance, between the time that you submit your application and when you go to take your test, please let the board know as soon as possible so that information can be conveyed so that you're allowed to take your test. If you show up and the name on your application doesn't match your ID, that would be another reason that you could forfeit your opportunity to take the exam. The other thing, so in terms of security requirements, Pearson VUE is pretty serious about maintaining test security for everybody who's taking the exams there. All kinds of licensing folks take exams there. It's not just social workers. And so there's a couple of things, like once you're in the testing room itself, you can't run back out to your car. You can't bring any personal items into the testing room. That includes smart watches, other forms of technology. There are some lock boxes outside the testing room. You can lock all your stuff up in there, but you can't bring anything personal into that testing room. You can certainly use the restroom, things like that. They have protocols for that. And all of the security requirements are going to be explained to you. Like there's no secret kind of thing about it. So you'll know what they are. But we just want to be clear that Pearson VUE is pretty serious about it. And if you violate one of the things that they've set out as a security requirement, that can invalidate your capacity to complete that exam or invalidate the score of your exam. So just important things to be aware of when you're taking the test itself. Now, in terms of exam tips, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. You're in college, you've all taken standardized exams. You know the big ticket items, right? Don't leave something blank. If you do, it's wrong. You know about distractors and multiple choice tests. ASWB absolutely employs distractors in their questions. So that whole piece about get rid of what you know to be wrong and then read it carefully. They're going to have questions like the social worker's first course of action is. The best thing for a social worker to do first is, things like that. So to really read carefully about those qualifying words. And then one of the things about the test system itself is it has a capacity for you to mark a question that you don't know. So if you get stuck on one, you don't have to spend all of your time worrying about that question in particular. You can mark it, move on, and when you get to the end of the exam, it will repopulate any questions that you have marked. It's not good test taking to mark everything and review everything. We know that that's not a good course of action when you're taking a standardized test. But if you get stuck on a couple of questions, go ahead, mark them, and then do those at the end. Especially if time is something for you when you're taking a test, that's a really nice feature to have. These are our 2020 exam pass rates. Minnesota is at the national average for the folks that take the bachelor's level exam. We have a 68% pass rate for first-time test takers. The only real piece around this would be two things. One, preparing for the exam, to take it seriously. They are rigorous exams. And then, oh, poof, just jumped out of my head. Rigorous exams. Oh, and then the closer that you take the exam to your academic training, the easier most people find the exam. So folks who wait 5 or 10 years to take the exam have a tendency to struggle more than folks that take it right after they've completed their program. So any questions about ASWB, Pearson VUE, the exam itself? Nothing? Okay. So let's assume everything has gone fantastic. You've completed school, you've taken and passed the exam, you've been granted your LSW license, you have a job in social work. What are the commitments that you're making as a practicing social worker in Minnesota? The first is licensing supervision. Licensing supervision is a requirement. It is not voluntary. It is a purposeful, intentional relationship that you have with the licensing supervisor. Now, the licensing supervisor could be somebody that you work for or work with in your agency, but does not have to be. And if there is not somebody at your agency that can provide licensing supervision, it is your requirement to get it privately in the community. The idea behind this licensing supervision relationship is really about promoting your growth as a social worker, looking at those standards of practice, looking at code of ethics, looking at how do you engage in competent, ethical social work practice and increase your skills. What does that look like? And having this person help navigate that with you. Now, in terms of when it's required, supervision and social work practice go together. What that means is you could finish school, get your LSW license, but let's say throughout college, you've had this really fantastic job working for a marketing agency. You want to keep doing that for a while, knock yourself out. You have your LSW license. There's no reason for supervision because you're not engaged in social work practice. The minute that you enter a job that is social work practice, supervision is going to be required. It is required for the first 4,000 hours of your non-clinical practice as an LSW. For a frame of reference, if you worked 40 hours a week, 12 months a year, 4,000 hours of practice is typically just over 2 years' time. We count in terms of hours, not in terms of months, because one of the things that we know about social work practice is all kinds of social workers are not working 40 hours a week or are not working 12 months a year. So over the course of the first 4,000 hours, you have to have supervision. How much is required? Over 4,000 hours, you need 100 hours of supervision. The pathway to that is for every 160 hours of practice, you need 4 hours of supervision with your licensing supervisor. So again, for a frame of reference, if you're working 40 hours a week, 160 hours is 1 month. So then it would be 4 hours of supervision a month. You know, if you are working less than 40 hours, your 160 hours will take you longer to get there. But for every 160 hours, 4 hours of supervision is required, moving toward completing 100 hours of supervision over the course of those first 4,000 hours of practice. In terms of the 100 hours, what's required is 50 of them have to be one-on-one supervision with your licensing supervisor, and 25 of those hours have to be in person. The other 50 hours, you have some more flexibility. You can certainly do all one-on-one supervision, or you can incorporate group supervision. You could do it on the telephone, you could do more virtual. That's up to you. But the first 50 hours have to be one-on-one with your supervisor and have to have 25 of them in person. Now, who can provide you supervision? As an LSW, you have a pretty broad spectrum of folks. It can be another LSW that has completed all of their supervision requirements, an LGSW, an LISW, or an LICSW. So any of those licensed social workers who have done what they need to do to provide supervision. And one of the things that includes is having completed 30 hours of training in supervision. You don't have to check on that. That's something that the supervisor will have to attest to. If you want to provide supervision moving forward in your career, that's something to be aware of that you need to do. But as the LSW, you can have another LSW, LG, LI, or LICSW provide supervision. Our state statute also allows for an alternate supervisor, and that would be somebody who has a mental health license through one of the other health licensing boards. So licensed psychologist, a marriage and family therapist, professional clinical counselor, a licensed psychologist, psychiatrist, and clinical nurse specialist in one of the mental health areas. So up to 25% of your supervision hours can be provided by an alternate supervisor. So doing the math, you need 100 hours, 25 of them can be provided by an alternate supervisor. Documenting your supervision, there's 2 different forms. The first is a supervision plan. So within 60 days of starting a job or starting something new, so a new job or a new supervisor, you have to submit a supervision plan. A supervision plan details where you work, who your supervisor is, and they attest to what kind of supervision they're going to provide and how frequently they're going to provide it. Then at license renewal, you have to submit supervision verification. The form is super similar to the supervision plan, but you and your supervisor are attesting to the supervision that has actually been completed during that renewal cycle. And again, it's due at license renewal. So let's see, in both of those forms, you can do through your online Board of Social Work account, or you can go to that resources tab. There's a forms page. You can download the forms and fill them out by hand and send them into the board office. Any questions about supervised practice or supervision? Okay, let's talk about continuing ed. Continuing education is one of the other commitments that we're making as a licensed social worker. Unlike supervision that's time limited, that has an end date, continuing education is required for the entire time that you have a license to practice social work in Minnesota. The goal behind continuing ed is legitimately to continue your education in the field of social work. That's why we have it. There's all kinds of activities that are acceptable for you to do for continuing ed, workshops and conferences, of which we have a ton in Minnesota. If you have the luxury of working for an employer that has embedded staff development that's pertinent to social work practice, you can use those hours. If you go back to school, so those of you that are going to go into a master's program, each semester credit counts as 15 continuing ed hours. So that's a super easy way to get your continuing ed. Any live interactive webinars, kind of like we're doing today, where you have access to the presenter, that's considered in person. So all of those are in-person continuing education options. The other thing that we have is up to 50% of the required continuing ed hours can be done through independent learning. So if you're reading something in particular about the field, if you're doing some research or preparing for a presentation, things like that, that can all be considered independent learning. And on the website under continuing education, they lay out how to document that if you're going to submit independent learning. In terms of how much is required, this is true for all of us at each license type. 40 hours, so this is on that 2-year cycle of renewal, 40 hours of continuing ed is required. Of those 40 hours, 2 must be in the area of ethics and 4 must be in the area of cultural responsiveness. Cultural responsiveness was just added this most recent legislative session to all the health licensing boards. So requirement for all of us, 40 hours, 2 in ethics, 2 in cultural responsiveness. If you're going to be providing supervision to other social workers, you must also have 6 hours of continuing ed in supervision. For your first license renewal, the total number of hours is going to be prorated, just like that fee was at the beginning. So depending on if you're longer or shorter than 24 months, you may have more or less than 40 hours. Your 2 hours of ethics and your 4 hours of cultural responsiveness, however, will not change. Those are required regardless of what the total number is. When you renew your license every 2 years, if you are still getting supervision, you have to send in your supervision information. You have to have those documents. Continuing ed is a little bit different. There's a checkbox on the application renewal online, and you're attesting to having completed your continuing ed. Keep your certificates of attendance because there's a random audit process. And if you're randomly audited, then you would have to submit the continuing ed. This is the definition of cultural responsiveness. Just because it's new, I've included it. It's really not a big step for social workers. Most folks are already engaged in this kind of work and this kind of learning. But since it's new, this is what it looks like. Any questions about continuing ed? Okay. Oh.
We have one question, and also we're really close to closing.
Yep.
Do you need to get your LSW before you get like your LSCSW?
You don't have to have your LSW unless you're going to engage in practice. So let's say you're completing your bachelor's program now and you're going into a master's program in the fall and you're not going to work in social work at all in the summer or while you're in your master's program other than an internship, then you don't have to have your LSW license. When you get your master's degree, the first license that you can get is that LGSW. You do have to have that license before you can get either the LI or the LICSW. If you're going to start working in social work after you graduate with your bachelor's degree, you do need your LSW license.
Okay.
All right. The only other area is talking about license renewal, and I've covered most of this already. It's every 2 years. It's in the month of our birthday. You can certainly keep your license active as long as you'd like, even if you're not practicing. You just have to renew every 2 years and turn in your continuing education. If you do not renew your license by the last day of the month of your birthday, your license will automatically expire. And then you'd have to go through a reactivation process, and it would cost you some more money. Moving forward, your LSW renewal fee is going to be $110. Again, you just have to attest to your continuing education hours. You have to turn in supervision verification documents if you're still receiving supervision. Otherwise, the application process is online. It's similar to what you're going to do for the original license application. And then at the end of the PowerPoint here, there's some website information for you. The Board of Social Work, my recommendation is take a look at the website before you need the website, because there is so much information on it. It's hard to navigate if you haven't looked at it before. The email address that's on there, social.work@state.mn.us, is the main clearinghouse. You can send any email questions there. You can send any documents to that email address, and they'll get filtered out to the right people. Criminal background check office if you need them, and then ASWB. And I've got the candidate services phone number on there too. And again, before you need to sign up for their exam, I would recommend kind of futz around their website a little bit so you have some idea about what you're looking for and looking at. So any last questions that I can answer for you guys? Try to power through to get it all for you. Is there anything that I've missed or you have wonderings about? Nothing in particular? Okay. Once you're licensed, the contact person for folks with the LSW license is Trelana Davis. So if you have particular questions about supervision or moving forward with your license, she would be your best contact person.
Great. Thank you. Okay.
You bet.
I wasn't sure where I see. Now I see myself. Yes. I'm not sure if we're still recording. I don't see the button anymore, but maybe we are. I hope we are. Oh, we are. Okay, that's good. Yeah, so thank you very much. Thanks everybody here. You can find me for questions too, otherwise. Okay.
All right, well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'll stop recording now if you want to hang on just a sec.
Okay.
Everybody.